I am an old woman now, my hands thin and spotted, my back bent slightly forward by years of work and worry, but my memory of that day remains sharper than anything that followed. The morning I buried my husband Elias was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath out of pity. The small wooden chapel sat alone at the edge of Amish farmland outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, surrounded by bare trees and frozen soil, and when I stepped inside, the cold followed me like an uninvited guest. The coffin rested at the front, polished dark oak, simple, just the way Elias had wanted it, and the smell of old wood and dust mixed with candle wax filled the air. I sat on the front pew by myself, the bench creaking softly under my weight, and I remember thinking how strange it was that a man could work his entire life, raise children, build a home, and still leave this world with no one but his wife to see him off. Our children were not there. Rowan, the eldest, had texted the night before to say he was already at the shore and couldn't change plans. Maeve sent a short message filled with rehearsed sympathy and a promise to call later. Coulter did not even pretend. He left a voicemail that sounded rushed, annoyed, as if death were an inconvenience that had arrived at the wrong time. I did not cry then. I had already cried enough during the nights Elias struggled to breathe, during the long hours at the hospital when machines hummed louder than his voice. What I felt in that chapel was heavier than grief. It was a slow, sinking realization that somewhere along the way, I had lost my children long before I lost my husband. As the pastor spoke, his voice echoing gently against the walls, memories kept rising without permission. Elias standing in our kitchen with dirt on his boots, laughing while fixing a broken cabinet. Elias teaching the kids how to bait a fishing hook at the creek behind our land. Elias sitting at the table late at night, doing the math over and over, making sure we could afford school clothes and property taxes without ever asking anyone for help. We were not rich, but we were steady, and I thought steadiness was something children carried with them into adulthood. I was wrong. When the service ended, there was no line of mourners, no murmured condolences, no shared stories. Just me, a tired pastor, and the sound of the wind outside. I followed the hearse to the cemetery myself, driving slowly, gripping the steering wheel tighter than I needed to. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, I whispered goodbye and promised Elias I would be all right, even though I did not yet know how untrue that promise would soon become. The ground thudded softly as dirt fell, each sound final and unforgiving, and when it was over, I stood there longer than necessary, because leaving felt like abandoning him all over again. Back at the farmhouse, the silence was unbearable. The walls still held echoes of old conversations, laughter from holidays, arguments that ended with slammed doors and apologies that came too late. Photographs lined the hallway, frozen moments of smiles and closeness that no longer existed. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at my hands, realizing that grief was no longer my greatest burden. Something colder had taken its place. A suspicion. A fear. I knew deep down that my children would come soon, not to grieve, not to remember their father, but to take inventory of what he left behind. And in that quiet house, with Elias gone and the phone finally ringing again, I understood that the worst chapter of my life was only just beginning. They came 3 days after the funeral, not together, not with the awkward tenderness I had once imagined adult children might show a widowed mother, but separately, like creditors arriving to assess damage. I heard Rowan's car first, the unfamiliar engine crunching gravel in the driveway, and my chest tightened before I even saw him. He stepped out wearing expensive boots that had never known mud, sunglasses still on his face despite the gray sky, phone pressed to his ear as he finished a call about a property deal somewhere near Harrisburg. When he walked inside, he glanced around the kitchen as if inspecting an investment rather than entering the home where he had grown up. He gave me a quick hug, stiff and brief, smelling of cologne and impatience, then asked how soon the lawyer would be coming. Not how I was feeling. Not whether I had slept. Just that. Maeve arrived next, rolling her suitcase across the porch as if she planned to stay longer, though I could tell from the way her eyes darted around that she was already measuring what might fit in her car. She hugged me longer than Rowan did, but her embrace felt performative, her hand patting my back while her gaze lingered on the cabinets Elias had built himself. She commented on how quiet the house felt, then immediately asked whether Dad had ever updated the paperwork on the land. Her voice was soft, almost caring, which somehow hurt more than Rowan's bluntness. Coulter showed up last, late in the evening, smelling faintly of beer and cigarette smoke, dropping his bag near the door like a teenager who still thought this place was a free hotel. He didn't hug me at all. He went straight to the fridge, opened it without asking, and complained there was nothing good to eat. When he finally sat down, he leaned back in his chair and said, "So, what happens now?" As if his father's death were a business meeting that had been delayed too long. They gathered around the kitchen table that night, the same table where Elias once carved turkey on Thanksgiving and helped the kids with homework, and they talked over one another with voices sharp and restless. Rowan spoke about market value, about how much farmland nearby was selling for, about taxes and subdivision potential. Maeve brought up renovations, suggesting the house could be converted into a rental property if we're smart about it. Coulter joked about selling the old tools online and keeping the cash. I sat there listening, my coffee growing cold, realizing they were already dividing a life that was not yet finished. I was still breathing. I was still sitting right in front of them. I tried to remind them that their father had just been buried, that some things deserved time, respect, silence. Rowan sighed and said emotions couldn't delay practical decisions. Maeve nodded and said we all grieve differently. Coulter rolled his eyes and said Dad wouldn't care anyway, because he's gone. That sentence landed harder than any insult. Elias had cared about everything. He cared about this land, about this house, about them. And they spoke of him as if he were an obstacle already cleared away. That night, lying alone in the bed that suddenly felt too wide, I stared at the ceiling and replayed their words again and again. I thought about the years Elias and I went without vacations, without new cars, because we were saving for their futures. I remembered how proud we were when each of them left, believing we had done our job well. Now I wondered where we had failed. Somewhere between scraped knees and graduation caps, something essential had drained out of them, leaving behind people I barely recognized. In the morning, I overheard Rowan on the phone, whispering about getting documents fast. Maeve asked where the safe was. Coulter joked about how long it would take before the place was sold. I moved through the house quietly, like a guest in my own life, and a thought began to take shape, slow but unshakable. If this was how they treated their father's memory, then I could no longer trust them with his legacy. That was the moment I understood I would need to act, not as a mother trying to fix her children, but as a woman protecting what little dignity and purpose remained to her. That night, after they finally went to bed or disappeared into their phones and private thoughts, I did not sleep. The house made small noises the way it always had, wood settling, wind brushing against the siding, the distant hum of the refrigerator, but everything sounded louder now, as if the walls themselves were listening. I lay there staring into the dark, Elias's side of the bed cold and untouched, and for the first time since his passing, I allowed myself to think not as a wife or a mother, but as a woman who had been awake for 73 years and had learned, slowly and painfully, how people reveal who they truly are. Sometime after midnight, I got up. My knees complained as I stood, and I paused to steady myself, pressing my palm against the dresser Elias had built with his own hands. The wood was smooth from decades of touch. That dresser had held his socks, his work shirts, the folded letters he never threw away. I whispered his name without meaning to, not as a prayer, but as a habit, the way one might reach for a light switch that no longer works. Then I left the bedroom and walked down the hallway toward the small study at the back of the house. That room had always been Elias's refuge. It smelled faintly of old paper and pipe tobacco, even though he hadn't smoked in years. Shelves lined the walls, filled with ledgers, manuals, a few worn novels, and folders labeled in his careful handwriting. I closed the door behind me and turned on the desk lamp, its yellow glow shrinking the world down to something manageable. In that quiet, I felt calmer than I had all day. No voices. No demands. Just truth. I sat at the desk and opened the bottom drawer, the one Elias had shown me long ago when we updated our insurance papers. Inside were blank envelopes, legal forms, and a small lockbox. I opened it slowly, aware that what I was about to do would change everything. My hands trembled, but not from fear. From certainty. I took out a stack of clean paper and a pen, and I began to write. I wrote about the house and the land, about the years of labor and love that went into every fence post and floorboard. I wrote about what Elias believed, how he used to say that money was only useful if it made life gentler for someone else. I thought about the soup kitchen in town where we used to donate quietly every winter. I thought about the foster kids I had met through church, children who arrived with nothing but a plastic bag and a wary stare. I thought about all the people Elias had helped without ever telling our children, because kindness to him was not a performance. Line by line, I made my choices. The farmhouse. The savings. The land. All of it would go to causes that eased suffering instead of feeding greed. As I wrote, memories kept surfacing. Rowan sneering at the word charity, Maeve calculating square footage, Coulter laughing about resale value. Each memory hardened my resolve. This was not punishment. It was alignment. I was placing what we built into hands that would honor its purpose. When I finished, the sun was beginning to rise, pale light slipping through the curtains. I signed my name slowly, carefully, as if signing meant I was finally claiming myself again. I folded the papers and placed them back into the lockbox, hiding it where only Elias and I had ever known to look. Then I sat there for a long time, listening to the house wake up, feeling a strange peace settle in my chest. For the first time since the funeral, I did not feel small. I did not feel powerless. I felt awake. And deep inside, I knew that when my children discovered what I had done, they would not react with understanding or remorse. They would react with anger. With desperation. With something far uglier. I didn't yet know how far they were willing to go, but as I turned off the lamp and left the study, one thought stayed with me, heavy and unshakable. I had crossed a line they would never forgive, and the real danger was only beginning. The change in them happened quickly, almost violently, though no one raised a hand at first. It began with silence. Not the ordinary kind that settles in a house after an argument, but a watchful silence, sharp around the edges. Rowan stopped pretending to be polite. Maeve stopped softening her words. Coulter stopped joking. They moved through the house differently now, opening drawers without asking, lingering too long near closed doors, lowering their voices when I entered a room. I felt it in my bones before I heard a single accusation. Something had shifted, and it was aimed directly at me. It was Rowan who confronted me first. He cornered me in the kitchen while Maeve and Coulter hovered nearby, pretending to busy themselves with their phones. He held a folder in his hand, papers I recognized immediately even before he slammed them onto the table. My signature stared back at me, calm and deliberate, surrounded by words he could not undo. His face was flushed, his jaw tight, the controlled anger of a man who had always believed the world would bend if he pushed hard enough. "What is this?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he already knew. I wiped my hands on a towel and sat down slowly. I was tired. Not just in my body, but in my soul. "It's my will," I said. "I made my choices." Maeve's composure cracked first. She laughed, a brittle sound that held no humor. "You can't be serious," she said. "You re-giving everything away." everything Dad worked for. I looked at her then, really looked, and saw not my daughter but a stranger wearing her face. Your father worked so others wouldn't suffer the way he once did, I replied. This honors him. Coulter swore under his breath and stood up, pacing the room. You're not thinking straight, he said. You re-emotional. You re-grieving. This isn't legal. Rowan leaned forward, hands flat on the table. We can fix this, he said, lowering his voice as if that made the threat gentler. We'll get a doctor. Someone to evaluate you. It doesn't have to be ugly. There it was. The line crossed. I felt something inside me go very still. You call me unfit? I asked quietly. Maeve avoided my eyes. Coulter didn't answer. Rowan didn't deny it. From that moment on, the house became a cage. They insisted I shouldn't be alone. They took my phone, claiming I was too upset to handle calls. When I said I wanted to go for my evening walk, Rowan offered to drive me instead, his smile tight and unconvincing. I refused. I had walked those roads for decades. I knew every bend, every tree. I would not give that up too. That evening, the air was cool, the sky low and heavy with clouds. I wrapped my shawl around my shoulders and stepped outside, grateful for the quiet. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes, a familiar sound that grounded me. For a few minutes, I allowed myself to believe they would let me be. I was wrong. I heard the car before I saw it. Then footsteps. Then Rowan's voice calling my name in a tone that was too controlled to be caring. I turned just as hands grabbed my arms. I stumbled, shocked more than hurt, and my heart began to race as panic surged through me like ice water. Maeve's voice pleaded in my ear, telling me this was for my own good, that I was confused, that everything would be fine if I just cooperated. Coulter stood nearby, pale and shaking, not stopping it, not helping me either. I was pushed into the back seat of the car. The door slammed. The engine started. The farmhouse disappeared behind us as we drove down roads I knew too well, roads that now felt unfamiliar and dangerous. I did not scream. I did not beg. Somewhere deep inside, a strange clarity took over. These were not frightened children. These were adults making a choice. As the car rolled on into the dark, one truth settled heavily in my chest. My children were no longer trying to change my mind. They were trying to take my freedom. And I understood then, with a cold certainty, that love alone would not save me anymore. I lost track of time during the drive. The roads blurred together, familiar landmarks swallowed by darkness, and the hum of the engine became a constant pressure against my thoughts. No one spoke. Rowan's hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly. Maeve sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, her face stiff as stone. Coulter was beside me in the back, close enough that I could feel the heat of his body, yet farther away than he had ever been in my life. The silence was heavier than shouting. It told me they had already decided what I was worth. When the car finally stopped, the air felt different. Damp. Cold. I was pulled out and guided, not gently, toward a building I could barely make out in the dark. An old barn, abandoned, leaning slightly to one side as if even it had grown tired of standing. The door groaned when they pushed it open. Inside, the smell of rot and dust hit my nose, and I had to steady myself to keep from coughing. A single lantern flickered on a crate, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted across the walls. They sat me down on a wooden chair that wobbled under my weight. My wrists were tied, not tightly enough to break skin, but enough to remind me I was not leaving by choice. I remember thinking how strange it was that the hands which once held mine while crossing busy streets now secured knots around my arms. Maeve paced the floor, her shoes crunching on straw. Rowan pulled papers from his jacket. Coulter stood off to the side, rubbing his face, avoiding my eyes. Rowan spoke first. He explained things as if this were a negotiation, as if logic could erase what they were doing. He said the will could be fixed tonight. That I only needed to sign a revised version. That no one had to know any of this happened. Maeve added that I would feel better afterward, that stress had clearly affected my judgment. Coulter said nothing, but his silence screamed louder than the others' words. I listened. I let them talk themselves into believing this was reasonable. When they finally paused, waiting for my answer, I lifted my chin and spoke as steadily as I could. I told them no. I told them I had lived long enough to recognize fear disguised as concern. I told them their father would be ashamed. That was when the mood changed. Rowan's face hardened. Maeve's voice rose, sharp and desperate. Coulter finally snapped, shouting that I was ruining all their lives. They took turns pressing me, threatening consequences they didn't fully name but clearly intended. Time stretched. My arms ached. My throat grew dry. Still, I refused. Somewhere in that long night, I realized something important. If I gave in now, I would lose more than property. I would lose myself. I don't know how long passed before I heard it. At first, it was just a sound, distant, easy to dismiss. Then it came again. A car door. Voices. A dog barking. Rowan froze. Maeve went pale. Coulter stepped back as if the air itself had burned him. The barn door burst open, flooding the space with harsh light. A familiar voice called my name, filled with urgency and anger. It was Walter, my neighbor, his jacket thrown over his work clothes, a flashlight shaking slightly in his hand. Behind him, red and blue lights painted the walls, flashing like a heartbeat. Law enforcement followed, their presence sudden and absolute. Everything happened quickly after that. My hands were untied. I was wrapped in a blanket. Questions were asked that I barely heard. My children were pulled away, their protests dissolving into chaos. I watched them go, not with satisfaction, but with a deep, aching sorrow. This was not how any of us were supposed to end up. As I was led outside, the cold air filled my lungs, clean and sharp. I looked up at the sky, dark and endless, and for the first time since Elias died, I felt something close to relief. I was alive. I was still myself. And though my heart was broken in ways I would never fully repair, I knew one thing with painful clarity. The night they tried to take everything from me was the night I finally took my life back. When morning came, it felt unreal, as if I had woken inside someone else's life. Pale light filtered through the hospital curtains, soft and cautious, and for a moment I didn't remember where I was. Then the weight of everything returned at once. The barn. The ropes. The sound of Walter's voice cutting through the dark. My children's faces as they were taken away. I closed my eyes and breathed slowly, the way Elias once taught me when panic crept in, counting each breath as proof that I was still here. They kept me overnight for observation, though I insisted I was fine. A nurse with kind eyes brought me tea and spoke gently, calling me ma'am as if that word itself carried respect. A sheriff came later to take my statement. He spoke plainly, without judgment, and told me I would not have to face my children again unless I chose to. That sentence stayed with me. Unless I chose to. Choice had been stripped from me for so long that hearing it spoken aloud felt like a gift I didn't yet know how to open. Walter visited before noon. He stood awkwardly by the door, hat in his hands, as if unsure whether he belonged in a place so clean and quiet. I reached out and took his hand, and he flinched at first, then relaxed. I thanked him, though the words felt too small for what he had done. He shrugged it off, said any neighbor would have done the same, but we both knew that wasn't true. Courage is common only after the fact. In the moment, it is rare, and it saves lives. When I returned to the farmhouse, it no longer felt like a battlefield. The rooms were still, almost respectful, as if the house itself was relieved I had come back alive. I moved slowly, touching familiar surfaces, grounding myself in the present. I opened windows.
I let fresh air in.
I gathered my children's abandoned belongings and placed them neatly by the door, not in anger, but with finality.
Some things do not need confrontation.
They need closure. In the weeks that followed, legal matters unfolded quietly. The will stood. The authorities handled the rest. I did not attend the hearings. I did not seek apologies that would only hollow me further. Instead, I began to live differently. I volunteered at the soup kitchen Elias and I once supported from a distance. I worked with my hands again, chopping vegetables, stirring pots, listening to stories from people who had lost far more than money. There was a strange healing in serving meals to strangers who thanked me as if I mattered. I gave away what I no longer needed. Not just possessions, but expectations. I stopped waiting for my children to become who I thought they were. I stopped replaying old memories, searching for signs I had missed. Love does not guarantee goodness. Time does not guarantee gratitude. These truths hurt, but they also freed me. Some evenings, I sat on the porch with Walter, sharing quiet conversation as the sun dipped behind the fields. We spoke of small things. Weather. Crops. Memories that didn't ache too badly. He never asked about my children. I never offered. What mattered was the present moment, the simple fact of peace. I am an old woman now, telling you this not to warn you against loving too deeply, but to remind you that dignity is not something others grant you. It is something you claim, even when it costs you everything you thought you were holding on to.
I lost my husband.
I lost my children in a way that still makes my chest tighten on certain nights. But I did not lose myself. And that, in the end, was the inheritance that mattered most.